My name is Julia Ng, and together with Alberto Toscano, I am the founding co-director of the Center for Philosophy and Critical Thought here at Goldsmiths. When we first started the center 3 years ago in May 2015, Alberto and I, and a number of colleagues around the college, were hoping to fill in a lacuna. Not so much at Goldsmiths as in the UK, a lacuna specifically regarding the rigorous philosophical work being done outside of most institutions of academic philosophy. And when I say the UK, I guess I really mean anywhere in the world, especially in places like the USA, where the same story is all too familiar. Philosophical work is taken seriously only insofar as it participates in insisting on the supremacy of the Anglophone voice, on an invariantly gendered and racialized corpus, or on the immateriality of the text and the insignificance of modes of linguistic experience other than the strictly apprehensive. And in turn, when I say anywhere in the world, I mean that sense of anywhere whose non-specific and non-localizable character is a privilege enjoyed by those who fall under a narrow designation of the term continent, which dominates even those places that have been havens for so-called continental thought. This non-specificity and non-localizability, or, if you will, this self-imposed impotence in the face of its own historical and political dimensions, is arguably what haunts philosophy whenever it finds itself paralyzed in the face of continual and sometimes violent change. The Center for Philosophy and Critical Thought was constituted to intervene in this juncture. As such, I can think of no better topic to inaugurate our new Goldsmiths Annual Philosophy Lecture Series than the work of Fanon. Thanks goes to the Departments of Sociology and of English and Comparative Literature for their abiding support of our endeavors. And with this said, I now hand over to Alberto, who will introduce the event and our speakers tonight. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, welcome everybody, and thank you, Julia, for the introductions. I'm going to try and be very brief because we actually have a rather rich schedule for this evening. As Julia mentioned, it's particularly apt in a sense for us to be discussing a text or a series of texts, and indeed an editorial project here, which, whilst of extremely rich in philosophical content, and in philosophical problems, and in philosophical questions, would be an extremely anomalous object to be found in just about any philosophy department that I have had an experience of. As we'll explore with Jean and Robert and Jane, and hopefully in the question time, even though the texts collected in Alienation and Freedom seem to, on the face of it, originate from domains of Fanon's intellectual and writing activity, which are distant from canonical philosophy, that being works in psychiatry, 2 plays, a number of texts often written anonymously or collectively for the publications of the FLN. One of the things that one discovers, both in the remarkable editorial work done by Jean and Robert and some other collaborators in the volume as well, but also in one of the most fascinating to me dimensions of the text, which is an annotated account of the contents of Fanon's library, and indeed Fanon's annotations to his books, was how much philosophical material went into Fanon's questioning of politics, psychiatry, and indeed how much went into also his dramaturgical thinking. And while some of the philosophers that make an appearance there will be figures that one already associates with Fanon, others might be less familiar. So discussions of the importance of Karl Jaspers or Fanon's annotations to books by Emmanuel Levinas, or the works of Simone de Beauvoir, or indeed extremely interesting developments around the place of Kierkegaard or Nietzsche in the work of Fanon, are all things that emerge in very interesting ways throughout the volume. And I hope we'll have a chance to discuss that this evening. So just to explain a little what the structure of the event will be, we'll have two talks by Jean Khalfa and Robert J. Soubiac, who are the editors here of the French, or the French version in Algerian publication, and of the very recent English translation. Two separate talks, which will be then followed by a reading of excerpts from two of the hitherto published texts, dramaturgical texts, and plays by Fanon, The Drowning Eye and Parallel Hands. And then we will have a response by Jane Hiddleston, which will then open up a discussion. So just a brief presentation of our speakers, which I'll then invite to come up. So Jean Khalfa is a fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, and a senior research fellow of the British Academy and Leverhulme Trust. He has written in the history of philosophy, modern literature, in particular contemporary poetry and writing in French from North Africa and the Caribbean, as well as articles on Pascal, Rousseau, Deleuze, Sartre, Césaire, and many other authors. I was particularly lucky for teaching purposes here at Goldsmiths to be able to rely on Jean's fantastic work on the edition, full edition of Foucault's History of Madness. And he's currently, I believe, working on a project on Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. Robert Young is the author of a number of books that have really shaped the field of post-colonial theory and studies of post-colonial literature, White Mythologies, Colonial Desire, and Post-Colonialism, an historical introduction. He's a correspondent fellow of the British Academy and a fellow of Academia Europaea, the Academy of Europe. And we also are lucky to have as a respondent Jane Hiddleston, who teaches in and around Francophone post-colonial literature and literary theory, and is the author of a number of books very directly relevant to the questions we'll be discussing this evening. Most recently, a book which has a chapter on Frantz Fanon entitled Decolonizing the Intellectuals, Politics, Culture, and Humanism at the End of the French Empire. Has also published other essays on Fanon, and is the author also of Understanding Postcolonialism and Structuralism and Postcoloniality, the Anxiety of Theory. So without further ado, I'll ask Jean to come up and present the slides.
Thank you. So what you're saying, is the sound okay? What you're seeing here is the Algerian edition of what Robert and I published 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago in fact, a large volume of texts by Fanon, which were thought lost or very difficult to access. And we're quite keen with La Découverte, the historical publisher of Fanon, that the book should be published on both continents at the same time, because as you will see if you read the correspondence that we have incorporated in this text, it's clear that Fanon wanted his book to be published primarily in Africa, The Wretched of the Earth, and that's significant for what he thought his books were doing, or were meant to do. This was in effect, as the Algerian publisher decided to do, the second volume of Fanon's complete works. And Bloomsbury has just published the English translation, which is a slightly expanded version of the 2015 edition in French. So what we intend to do today is to show how his works, in fact, gathered in this large volume, and his works deepen the understanding of the classical works by Fanon that we all know, And I will focus more on the relationship of his psychiatric text to his political texts, in particular regarding the question of political violence and neocolonialism. And Robert will focus more on the literary texts, which we also publish in this edition, his theater. But this theater, of course, as you will see, is also a political theater. So, as you know, from his first published book, Black Skin, White Mask, Fanon refused to grant political action as well as ethical obligation on any sense of identity, whether this identity is ethnic or humanist. Famous text, it's not the black world that governs my behavior, my black skin is not a repository for specific values. And he immediately jumps to a sort of rational humanism. The starry sky that left Kant in Rome has long revealed its secret to us, and more Rome has doubts about itself. Values, in fact, for him can only derive from an act, rather than the act being derived from inherited values. Sartre has shown that the past along the lines of an inauthentic mode of being takes or congeals, and once solidly structured and gives form to the individual. This is the past turning into value. But I can also revise my past, valorize it or condemn it through my successive choices, and then later on, I do not want to be the victim of the rules of the black world. My life should not be devoted to drawing up the balance sheet of Negro values. And hence his well-known irony towards Césaire, Césaire, the inventor of negritude. This poem, Fanon knew by heart, the Notebook for a Return to Native Land, and at the same time, quotes, but at the same time, parodies. Famous passage by Césaire, where Césaire introduces negritude. Fanon parodies it. The drums jabber out the cosmic message. Only the black man is capable of conveying it, of deciphering its meaning and impact. I strike the world, my heels digging into its flanks. I rub the neck of the world, like the high priest rubbing between the eyes of his sacrificial victim. Irony towards Césaire, and also in his famous diary of travel through Africa. Sorry, it's here on the right. The idea of spreading Algeria to Africa, that is revolution towards nationalism, and Africa to Algeria, and as a consequence, diversity to a revolution, were off our mission to open the southern front to transport arms and munitions from Bamako, etc., famous text, and then what I should like, great lines, great navigation channels to the desert, subdue the desert, deny it, assemble Africa, create the continents that Malians, Senegalese, Guineans, Ghanaians should descend from Mali onto our territory, and those of the Ivory Coast, of Nigeria, of Togoland, and they should all climb the slopes of the desert. It's not clear that the FLN would have really appreciated such a sudden diversity injected into the national struggle to turn it into a revolution. And you probably remember how much all the remarks on national culture in The Wretched of the Earth are again against the idea that national culture should coincide with an identity. And this is one of the additions to this volume. I found the first draft of the table of contents of The Wretched of the Earth. First, the title initially was Algiers, Cape Town, this idea of Pan-Africanist movement, and a chapter which Fanon didn't have time to write as a separate chapter, but which is incorporated in some way on the chapters on national culture, was entitled Negritude and Negro-African Civilization, a Mystification. This is an important word. All alienation for Fanon is grounded in a mystification, and all mystification is a fetishism or an essentialism. And Fanon, for instance, often describes religion as an imaginary exercise of power by the powerless, and essentialization of this power that he or she doesn't have. So that's the French edition on the left, and the new edition, published by Bloomsbury last month, on the right. And since this publication, the wider readership has realized that Fanon was not just a psychiatrist, but also a psychiatrist who wrote some important theoretical texts in the domain that he was working in, which was the interaction between the neurological and the psychiatric. And he was recognized as a very significant writer by his contemporaries in this domain. It's just that retrospectively, the size of his and the importance of his political work makes it, in a way, covered this work, made it quite improbable that his work would have been also significant as a scientific work. What's really striking, though, from my point of view this evening, but we can discuss more at length later on the psychiatric works and the details of this edition, but what's striking when reading the mass of his psychiatric texts as a whole is how much the concepts in these texts inform his political thought, and that's what I want to say a few words about right now. His psychiatric thought, this is a copy of his his medical PhD. His psychiatric thought unfolds on two levels. It's first a criticism of the taxonomic essentialism of psychiatry so far, which projects organic categories onto mental illnesses. An organicist or a constitutionalist point of view, constitutionalism is the word he uses, which he refuses early on and which he will, in fact, much later on, adamantly criticize when dealing with colonial ethnopsychiatry, which of course tries to essentialize some traits of, that it links to race. He debunks it by studying a set of neurodegenerative diseases which coincide with very different mental syndromes. So a particular neurological disease may in fact coincide with a number of psychiatric syndromes that are very different from each other. And from then on, he can demonstrate that there is a neurological psychiatric gap, and that culture in some way and social environment is going to determine the psychiatric forms or impacts that these neurological troubles will entail. And the second level of his thought is, of course, the theoretical theories that are made possible by the experimental demonstration of this organo-psychiatric gap. And for him, mental illness is not a fixed biologically determined disease. It is in fact a faulty reconstruction of personality, often following an initial organic disturbance, which has led to a dissolution of personality. And psychiatric internment only serves to solidify these faulty reconstructions, artificially producing, so to speak, the object of study of psychiatry, fixed categories of mental illnesses. And in that, Fanon pretty much works in the same line as Foucault, who will follow that in great detail in his History of Madness. In the subsequent psychiatric texts, which he wrote mostly with the revolutionary anti-psychiatrist François Tosquelles, who supervised his internship, he analyzed new therapeutical methods that they had developed. So those faulty reconstructions of personality need to be dissolved by a new shock. So you will find in this edition a number of texts advocating different shock therapies, which may seem gruesome to us, but then they say that we should not fetishize personality. It can be dissolved and reconstructed. And the asylum on its own needs to be reorganized in such a way that it becomes the instrument for the reconstruction of personality once the faulty reconstructions of personality that had followed a neurological trouble have been dissolved again. And the asylum needs to be reorganized in a very different form from what existed before, which could be called a vigilant society, in that each participant, medical staff, nurses and patients, learn to take responsibility at each instant of each of their acts and to continuously produce their present, which implies a complete reform, of course, of the institution, its physical and temporal organization, hence the term psychiatrie institutionnelle or social therapy. So Fanon was a pioneer of anti-psychiatry, and as you can see from this quote here, he saw a direct link with this transformation of the asylum and the work that he was going to do on a historical and political level. The occasion will arise, that's in his PhD, in his medical PhD. The occasion will arise in a work on which we have been working for a long time to tackle the problem of history from the psychoanalytic and ontological angle. In it, we will show that history is only a systematic valorization of collective complexes. A bit before, he said our medical optics is spatial, or it should increasingly be temporalized. Now, if we read the political text, we realize that Fanon transposed this model of the dissolution of personality and then the social therapeutical reconstruction of it to the theory of colonialism almost verbatim. He reuses the same expressions. And he describes colonialism as producing the colonial shock, colonization, as producing a dissolution of the personality of a particular society, which then reconstructs itself in an alienated manner along several fault lines, which he puts under three categories pretty much, but they are permeable. Religion first, and phantasms. You have those long descriptions of trance, voodoo, and so on in The Wretched of the Earth. That's one category. Crime and violence, or servile imitation, as in the case of his native Martinique. This category being, of course, the one studied in Black Skin, White Mask. So these are different forms of alienation or faulty reconstructions of personality that are produced by following the colonial shock. Now, he thinks political disalienation, you know that the first title he had chosen for Black Skin, White Mask was an essay in the disalienation of the black man. He thinks disalienation along the lines of psychiatric disalienation, and this has crucial consequences on his conception of the revolutionary process, in particular on the largely misunderstood role of violence in his thought. Fanon has a much more complex conception of violence than is usually assumed. There's no real celebration of violence, which is for him an effect of madness, agitation in psychiatric terms. Madness being always defined, he uses this expression from the very beginning until the end, as a pathology of freedom. So there's no immediate freeing of the exercise of violence in his thought. It is the struggle, and the words that he uses are lutte or combat, of a people which can be therapeutical when this struggle is part of a revolutionary struggle. And the reason why the national struggle, la lutte, is important is that in it necessarily occurs a reform of the social structure of the revolutionary group, and that struggle produces, for the first time in this society, an authentic social bond, and in turn, that activity of instituting this social bond in the same process as that of psychotherapy or social therapy, this, he says, detoxifies. He doesn't use the word cleanse, which is often used in the translations of The Wretched of the Earth. He says detoxifies, désintoxique, as in a cure de désintoxication, when you undergo detoxification from an addiction. So it detoxifies you from what? From subservience to leaders, and in particular, in newly decolonized countries where the local elites rush to take the place of the colonizers, it detoxifies you from the respect of what he calls the stooges of imperialism. And we publish here for the first time this article, which hadn't been published in English, even though it had been first issued in English as a propaganda document. So this text, the stooges of imperialism, stresses exactly that. Now, if you look at the book, The Wretched of the Earth, from that angle, and plenty of the texts that we publish from the political writings of Fanon show that one should, then The Wretched is all about what could go wrong in the revolutionary process, how the disalienation would not or could not occur, and how the theories of subversion that had been proposed could turn into instruments of oppression, which we know now that they did. And in the Algerian case, even more through the manipulation of some of his texts. So let's have a quick look at some of the texts that we have here. So that's the general framework that I wanted to describe, how the pattern of alienation and disalienation within the psychiatric domain is reproduced analogically within the anti-colonial domain. So for instance, you'll find in this edition some of the editorials that Fanon wrote for the newspapers of the psychiatric asylums where he worked. First, the one in France where he trained, in Saint-Alban. And the first text, is in fact the first published text probably by Fanon, is a text called The Therapeutical Role of Commitment, Rôle thérapeutique de l'engagement. And this is where he defines this concept of vigilance that I have alluded to. Fanon saw his editorials in these journals as training texts for the nurses, so not just as texts that were addressed to the patients, whom he urges not to fall asleep, but also to his nurses. And that's the journal that was published, that he created, and that was published in Blida when he arrived and took his first post in Algeria, in North Africa, which was in Algiers. It's called Notre Journal, and this I reproduce here a text on the idea of a disciplinary code. Fanon criticizes the tendency of all liberating or disalienating institutions to turn into repressive mechanisms. In this case, the football club had started, which he had created, it was a king footballer, the nurses had invented a system of disciplinary punishments for the patients who did not act in the right way. And he spent time in 1956, when everything was becoming very dangerous for him, to write 3 texts against that, which are in fact a theory of the solidification of institutions against the will of those who have created them. Plenty of other texts that I could quote, just to, but I don't want to spend too much time on that. We will keep some time for the discussion. But the way he describes the colonial world is the way he describes internment in the asylum. The first thing the colonial subject learns is to remain in his place and not overstep its limits. The dreams of the colonial subject are muscular dreams, dreams of actions, dreams of aggressive vitality. You know all these texts about the crumbling of the body schema. I came into the world anxious to uncover a meaning in things, my soul desirous to be the origin of the world. And here I am, an object among other objects. And this is a text which then continues showing how the situation we colonize who experiences racism for the first time is the same as that of an individual submitted to a medical gaze. And again, when he describes mental illness appears as a real pathology of free will. The classic hospitalization considerably limits the patient's scope for action, forbids any compensation, leads to suicidal conducts, or to escapes through dance, trance, religion. During the struggle for liberation, there will be a singular loss of interest in such rituals, he notes. And the social therapy is described exactly in the same way as he describes political disalienation. Social therapy tears the patient away from his fantasies and forces him to confront reality in a new way. In the same way that in the Wretched of the Earth, in the liberation struggle, these people who were once relegated to the realm of the imagination, victims of unspeakable terrors, but from time to lose themselves in hallucinatory dreams, are thrown into disarray, reform, and amid blood and tears give birth to the very real and urgent issues, practical tasks, which the people are asked to undertake in the liberation struggle. And he has no time for suicide. Now, just a few words on this famous text, the final paragraph of the first chapter of The Wretched of the Earth on violence. It's often interpreted as being a celebration of violence because of Sartre's famous preface on the one hand, on the other hand because the translations are bad, both the existing ones. At the individual level, violence is a cleansing force. Or la violence désintoxique, should be violence detoxifies. But when you keep on reading this text, you realize that what it reads the colonized of is their inferiority complex, their passive and despairing attitudes. It emboldens them, restores their self-confidence, even if the armed struggle has been symbolic, and even if they have been demobilized by rapid decolonization, the people have time to realize that the liberation was the achievement of each and every one, and no special merit should go to the leader. A bit later on, when they have used violence to achieve national liberation, the masses allow nobody to come forward as liberator. And then later on, the praxis, which pitched them into a desperate man-to-man struggle, has given the masses a ravenous taste for the tangible. Any attempt at mystification in the long term becomes literally impossible. Praxis is the activity through which you change the world, but also you change and create yourself. So this process of disalienation that effective revolutions carry through is the object of a concrete study by Fanon, L'Enseigne de la Révolution Algérienne, year 5 of the Algerian Revolution, which is absurdly translated as a dying colonialism. Well, in fact, Fanon in his text is not really interested in what happened in the past. Colonialism is dead already for him. But more in the process through which, through the revolutionary struggle, even though it's only year 5 of the Algerian Revolution, it will take 4 more years for it to really reach independence, through this struggle, what was object before becomes living. And if you reread this text, you will see that all the objects which are described in this strange assemblage, the veil, the transistor radio, private family life, medicine, the minorities, in each of these cases, what colonialism had done was to solidify these things into inert objects, an inert block of culture, and then suddenly they take on a new meaning through these transformations that the struggle allows. Those who were spectators of their own objecthood, those who lived in separation from their conditions of living, from their actions, have now become actors, as Fanon writes at the beginning of The Wretched of the Earth. Decolonization never goes unnoticed, for it bears on being and fundamentally alters being. It transforms spectators, crushed by their inessentiality, into privileged actors. Theatre was in his thought from the very beginning, captured in a virtually grandiose fashion by the spotlight of history. It brings a natural rhythm into being. This question of natural rhythm is constant in his work. It's the body that needs to be liberated, introduced by new men, a new language, and a new humanity. Decolonization is the veritable creation of new men, but this creation owes nothing of its legitimacy to any supernatural power. The thing which has been colonized becomes a man through the very process by which it frees itself. Now, this critique of an alienated society as a society of the spectacle, which anticipate many of the texts that were written in the 60s, not just a society of fascination for objects and images or phantasms, and Fanon had written on cinema also, but a society where human beings are separated from the products of their creation, as well as the creative process, and where they see their cultures and themselves as things. This is a conception that inhabits Sartre's rereading of Marx in the Critique of Dialectical Reason, which Fanon read as soon as it was published, and on which he lectured, apparently, to the officers of the FLN, the army of the borders. Unfortunately, he couldn't get hold of the tapes, which belonged to the Algerian army, if they still exist, it's certainly a difficult thing to wrestle from that. But we have access to pathological documents. Some of them are expected to have been classified, but we can discuss those later on. From this point of view, this alienation can never be given by some authority or event. It must be a process of self-creation, which by nature will contradict all oppression. But it's not an easy process. Changing structures is not enough. And extreme vigilance must be maintained at all times if these structures are not to become empty shells. And the independence process, another form of alienation. We have a lot of testimonies that show that Fanon at the end was starting to doubt whether the independence movement was still a revolutionary movement. He was, by the end, when he was writing Wretched of the Earth, an ambassador in Africa, so he could see first of the FLN to sub-Saharan Africa at large, based in Accra. He could see firsthand the forms of neo-colonialisms that were developing. And of course, it's very well known that the French Communist Party had become irrelevant to decolonization and to the Algerian War, which will play a major role in the following developments of the left in France. But the FLN also, it seems, was becoming for him an object of suspicion and fear, and we can discuss that later on. In a way, Fanon's theater, written in 1948, anticipated this dilemma of a Promethean revolutionary process producing its opposite. I've just reproduced a couple of excerpts that you're going to hear in a moment. From the tragedy, there are two plays. One is a bourgeois drama, the other one is a tragedy in a classical sense. And in that one, it's a sort of tragedy of concepts, but it stages the revolutionary movement that occurs on an island, which had been plunged in darkness by the authorities in order to keep it peaceful. And the main character kills the king, his father, and precipitates all sorts of catastrophic events. And he declares, "What are history and the future to me, the Eucharistic beauty of the past, ancestral virtues, future elevation." And a bit later on, Odaline, his girlfriend, on reaching the volcanic extremes, speech makes itself act. But perpendicularly, I make my way. So Fanon was, from 1948, when he wrote those texts, Fanon was already quite aware of the complexities and the difficulty to predict the consequences of a Promethean process would be, because the result of the play, the unfolding of the play, as you will see, is in fact, through this parricidal murder, to lead to a total crumbling of society. Catastrophic consequences. Robert is going to speak in an instant about this theater, and you're going to stress, to hear some of the main passages from it, but I just want you to keep with you, perhaps, and then we can develop that in the discussion, how much all these texts, the literary texts, the psychiatric texts, the political texts, are all facets, in a way, of a thought which is constantly moved by one fundamental drive or intuition, which is that without a permanent vigilance, no disalienation will ever occur, and without disalienation, no revolution will take place. And that's really what I think these new texts add to the ones that we knew so far. Thank you.
Let's either leave it in. Okay, so we can leave the image from the beginning. Oh, okay.
Great. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here at Goldsmiths again. I've been here for a few decades, I think. But being here, I'd just like to remember my friend, the late Barton Gilbert, who taught here for many years, and to mention another editorial effort that I've been involved with, which is actually the collection and printing of what he left in manuscript of his work on Palestinian fiction that he was working on when he passed away. That's been published in a recent edition of Interventions, Post-Colonial Studies, 20#1. Along with a whole series of essays on Bart's work, which considers his work overall. So, but he never lived, unfortunately, to finish his book, but what he left of that book is there in that issue. So, in terms of today's editorial work, the remnants of Frantz, which Jean and I have been quietly collecting and trying to reconstruct for actually a couple of decades, I think. As Jean Albert mentioned, I'm going to talk about the two plays. The first one, Louis and Moi. We thought for a long time about how to translate that. We translated it finally as The Drowning Eye, but that slightly loses the impact of the French, which is literally translated is also the eye drowns, or even the eye drowns itself, reflexive. So it's got more of an active sense there. And Les Mains Parallèles, which is easy to translate with the parallel hands. And people knew about these plays along with the third one called Conspiration, Conspiracy, which is probably lost. But people knew about all three of the plays really from the beginning. They were sometimes considered lost, and they were subject to quite a lot of speculation, but nobody, or maybe half a dozen people, I should say, not maybe half a dozen people had maybe seen them before they sat with Fanon for many years. They deposited two of them in Imec in France. We don't know what he did with the third. Maybe he destroyed it. Maybe it's in his attic. We still don't know. Now that we can actually read them and experience them live, as you will do shortly, they certainly surprise us. David Macy, in his biography, says that they were probably sort of pastiche of Sartre plays, which they undoubtedly not good, as certainly the Sartre influence that can be detected. But there are a number of things that are surprising. And I suppose the first one is that, as you can sort of see from these short extracts here, it's first of all, when you start to read them, is the extraordinary obscurity and abstraction of the language. Secondly, given that they were written 1948 and 1949, at the same time that Fanon was drafting what would become Black Skin, White Masks, what's curious is that they seem to be written without almost any reference whatsoever to race. And indeed, actually, the world in which Fanon lived, the real world, the sort of material historical world in which he lived, they are entirely, you might say, philosophical. And as I mentioned, the contents of Fanon's library shows the extraordinary amount of philosophy that he was reading while he was a medical student. In fact, I'm surprised he managed to pass his exams at all, because he spent so much time annotating and reading philosophical works. It's amazing that, given the rigors of doing a medical degree, that he survived as a psychiatrist. So they were composed 48, 49, when Fanon was in Lyon, where he'd chosen to go rather than Paris. The language of the place, as you can see just briefly there, is abstract, it's densely metaphorical in style, and it's surrealistic. It's got the whole flavour of surrealism and surrealism's unexpected juxtaposition. And when you read the plays, they're certainly at first sight and certainly second reading, or maybe third in my case, they seem totally hermetic. And indeed, our publisher, when he first read them, confessed that he didn't understand a word of them. And that was one of the reasons why people who did see them considered them not worth publishing, because they really couldn't make a lot of them. What's particularly extraordinary, given the density of the language, is to remember that Fanon never, or almost never, wrote by hand, or he dictated all his work. So he was actually composing this live. It's a form of speech, and it actually, I think, comes across better when spoken than when read. But it's that quality of speech that gives them a characteristic of being both, on the one hand, very abstract, but also very vividly immediate, as people see. As I was working on them, trying to work out what they're about, I gradually began to feel that actually, unexpectedly, they correlate with two Fanon's best-known works, that is Black Skin, White Masks, and The Rest of the Earth. That unexpectedly, you would expect them to link up to Black Skin, White Masks, because they were around the same time, but the second play in particular, Parallel Hands, actually, as John's already indicated, I think, looks forward, in certain respects anyway, to the Wretched of the Earth. And to the degree that they do link both ways, and if you also take into account the enormous amount of psychiatric work that is published in this volume, I think what it does is it's actually enable us to try to make sense of Fanon's work overall for the first time. That historically, certainly in the English-speaking world, the translation of Wretched of the Earth came first, and was taken up at the time of the Black Panthers, of revolutionary consciousness, and so forth. And it's obviously always had a much harder political cachet in terms of international politics, and has a reasonable element of Marxist thinking in it, though it's relatively restricted, but certainly the influence of Marx is there. And that Fanon has in some sense been taken up by a certain constituency. And then later in the 1980s, with publication in English of Black Skin, White Masks, that seemed to lead to a completely different Fanon, which was all about race and identity politics. And these two Fanons seem to offer different constituencies, different, you might say, political analyses. But very often, if you look at Fanon material, or if you look at work within postcolonial studies, people actually kind of scrap at each other from one Fanon to the other. They tend to define themselves politically by which Fanon they adopt. But what I think you can see now is that actually Fanon's thinking was remarkably consistent throughout his life, and actually to a large degree worked by homology, that actually what he thought in one sphere he tended to transfer to another. And psychiatry in particular, I think, helps us to see how his political thinking was very heavily influenced by his psychiatric thinking, and his plays anticipate that, because he was actually, that was the work he was doing at that time. He was not only reading philosophy, but also reading the psychiatry that made up the analysis of his thesis. So the plays are both obsessed, I suppose you could say, with existential issues as well, or particularly of death and transcendence. The first play, The Drowning Eye, is basically, as Fanon as Jean suggested, a bourgeois one-act drama, which is narrates a conflict between two brothers who seem closely to resemble Fanon himself and Joby, his brother. So the France-like brother is called François, and he's rejected the everyday bourgeois social world to which his brother Lucien belongs. He speaks to nobody except his lover, Ginette, and he seems to be seeking some form of exit from the world through a transcendence, through some kind of immanence, and immanence within the material world, assimilating himself to the natural material universe. Maybe something about that cosmic dimension that he attacks in that passage in Bridge of the Earth. He basically wants to move from the human to the inhuman, and in saying that, you immediately get a sense of something I'm going to talk about a bit later, which is Nietzscheanism of this early phenomenon. Most of the action of the play, it's very French, so there's no drama at all. Basically, it's all talk. So there isn't really any action, but most of the narrative of the play, perhaps we should say, consists of the second brother, Lucien, decrying the morbidity of Francois and trying to seduce Ginette to leave Francois and come and lead a normal bourgeois life with him. And eventually, after a long scene 3, where they debate Francois and his merits or demerits, she does indeed leave him briefly and go off with Lucien. So that structure constitutes really an echo of a play that Fanon probably saw in Lyon, Paul Claudel's Partage du Midi, where you have exactly that structure, and then in the same way, actually, this elopement of the two lovers ends in disaster. And the final scene of The Drowning Eye, Ginette returns to Francois, repentful. And in a bizarre turn, having challenged the authenticity of her love in the first scene and saying he doesn't really believe that she loves him, and nothing she can say can prove that she loves him, the very fact that she's left him and returned to him seems to actually, for the first time, prove the authenticity of her love for him. And the play leads with him standing up and speaking to her and taking her to what he describes as the gates of the absolute where life is seized. So one notable feature of the play is that Francois only speaks in the first scene and then in these closing words of the last. And the whole of the rest of the play is taken up by a dialogue between Lucien, the Joby-like brother, and Ginette, talking about Francois. So you could describe it as a sort of dramatized, self-obsessed critique or autobiographical self-critique, because the whole subject of the play is Francois. Nothing else really. The second longer 4-act play, which is perhaps more difficult precisely because it's not a bourgeois drama. It takes the form of a Greek tragedy, or a pastiche Greek tragedy, in which the hero, Epitalos, as Jean mentioned, on his wedding day, instead of getting married, kills his father, who's the ruler of a small island, as a ruler, he's deemed to have been complicit with the power, the oppressive power of the gods. Certainly, that's how Epitalos characterizes it. This patricide, regicide, unleashes death and destruction on the island, including the suicide of Audeline, his fiancée. And then very interestingly, simultaneously, the alpha male role of men, Epitalos in particular, is simultaneously critiqued by Audeline's mother, by Epitalos' putative mother-in-law, from the very first. And in the final act, his mother and would-be mother-in-law remonstrate with him for what he's done, not only being the father, but particularly for the chaos that he's unleashed, the political chaos that he's unleashed on the island, and for his destructive, egotistical, Promethean ambition, which he's been so obsessed with. You can see here that Fanon had been reading not only Sartre, but also some multiple work. Somewhat repentant, mildly repentant, I suppose you might say, he sacrifices himself at the end, and seems to, that sacrifice basically leaves the only people who survive are the mother and the mother-in-law, so that seems to indicate some move to a new kind of order, a new maternal order in which alpha male power structures will be removed. Now, what's noticeable about both plays is that they both involve a rejection of the socio-cultural political status quo. So they're both actually hostile to the society that they're set in. And the second involves, as we said, a violent revolutionary overthrowing of the current regime. And nothing in the psychiatric writings, or indeed, as far as I can really determine, anything in Fanon earlier than the Algerian material much later on, really have prepared us for his interest in revolutionary political violence. So the parallel is an extraordinary anticipation of the Wretched of the Earth from that point of view. And that Oedipal revolutionary violence can be linked not only to the Wretched of the Earth generally, but also to his psychiatry and to his interest in electric shock treatment, which was perhaps something we hadn't expected, but because at one level he's very into anti-psychiatry, but he also was a great believer in electric shock, or the method of as it was known, which was basically about erasing the distorted mental constructions that constitute mental illness and starting again. And we can see that paradigm of erasure and reconstruction actually is consistent from the non-parallel through the psychiatry and into the Wretched of the Earth. What's different from the Wretched of the Earth, however, as I've already indicated, is that Fanon doesn't invoke Marx. He doesn't actually appear to have read any Marx at this point. He quotes him in Fanon, so he's not long before he's reading Marx, but the dominant influence politically here is Nietzsche. I'll come back to that in a minute. In The Drowning Eye, we can, I think if you, it's not on the surface, but if you read it very carefully, you can detect concerns certainly that relate to the earlier chapters of Black Skin, White Masks in relation to questions of language, identity, and race. Race, although it's not foregrounded, does actually emerge, if you like, in little signals to the side. What's significant, though, is that he doesn't foreground the whole issue of skin color. And I think in attempting to write a play which is obviously deeply infused by thinking about race, but actually without talking about race, he was really trying to put into practice an argument that he makes in Pour Noir, which is that basically difference should be a matter of indifference. That the oppressive sense of being racialized as a minority that he describes in that book and objectified by white society is exactly what Fanon wishes to get away from, to erase that person and to reconstruct himself otherwise. He didn't want to be marked out and regarded as different. What he doesn't like is being pointed out by people. Or he doesn't like to be complimented on his French because it's so good, just because he's a black person. And he doesn't want Alain Negritude to turn that projected difference into the grounds of his own social and cultural identity. He wanted, we might say, simply to be different or the same, to be allowed the dignity of being ordinary and unremarkable, indifferently the same. And this is what he says in Black Skin, White Masks. I wish simply to be a man among men. I wish to be a man, nothing but a man. In other words, just indifferently a human being, using the man in that sense there. So, Drowning Eye, I think, explores some of the psychological effects of racialization without foregrounding that. And the only indication of the skin color of the characters is given in a series of sort of bizarre analogy. They're not described as being white or black. Francois himself is described as being the color of pewter, which is a very interesting metal because if you think about pewter, particularly if it's been polished, it can look both black and white according to the light. And in some sense, just as in Pour Noir, Fanon talks about the different positionalities of black men, white women, white men and black women, and he kind of moves between the positions of all of them. So for the audience watching the play, Francois, by being indeterminately, you can't tell, he's not specified whether he's black or white. So everybody's in a way being positioned according to different dynamics without us being able to actually decide one way or the other. So you could say he's in some sense he's an in-between, or maybe more that he's neither and both at once, which is actually exactly what Fanon complained of feeling like when he was at Lyon, because the whole point of Fanon was that he felt that he was French, but he wasn't regarded as French when he was in Lyon. So he had this real issue with his own identity, that he was his identity was taken away from him and he was given a new identity in France. So, the way in which he communicates his sense of the oppressive presence of whiteness in any form in Black Skin, White Masks. Think of that famous incident of the railway carriage where the child points to him, and he feels his blackness, he says, is precipitated into the cold whiteness of winter and is transformed into a white ash. Whiteness as a term is always very overdetermined, and it's always typically associated with death. And in fact, la mort blanche is a phrase that is used repeatedly in this play. But what's specific and complicating about the language of the play is its surrealistic, metaphorical mode that moves between a whole series of incompatible registers, very often within a single phrase. So abstract and concrete tend to get confused with each other. And that's something that the play can imagine much more vividly than in any account in the prose. So, for example, the philosophical nothingness that is described in Black Skin, White Mask, neon, just means nothing, is transformed into a more directly somatic experience in Parallel Hands, where it's described as a kind of voided nakedness. He says, ma nudité écumeuse, which is Steve translated as my foaming nudity, which is a bit strange translation. Écumeuse means, it does mean foam, but it's sort of scum, it's worthlessness as well, worthlessness, scummy worthlessness, nakedness. I don't know what would be a better translation. So, basically, Drowning Eye precipitates us into this sort of existential situation of preoccupation with nothingness, of being preoccupied with mortality and white death, the hideous spasm of anguish and death, which moves towards this idea that you can actually only achieve freedom in some form of absolute otherness, some form of inhuman cosmic materiality. And that's when the play ends. The final movement, the final moment of the play, offers a vision of a transcendence beyond the exigencies of everyday life and of self-consciousness. And Francois seems to resolve his unsupportable ambivalence. He's very ambivalent, but he doesn't like his ambivalence. That's the difference between modern ambivalence and Fanon's ambivalence. The problem is his ambivalence, that he's caught between these different dynamics, and he wants that to be resolved. Now, his procedure in these plays of leaving so much implicit and forcing us really to think through, to try and tease out the implications of his work, contrasts very dramatically, I think, with the dominant linguistic and political influence on the plays, which is not that of Sartre, but that of Aimé Césaire, whose own work, published in this period, the Cahiers, the Notebook of Return to My Native Land, the Miraculous Arms, I think it's translated, and Soleil Coupé of 1948, are all very highly political texts. And it's worth noting that actually Césaire repeatedly revised his text according to his preoccupations and political preoccupations in the moment, as he goes through being a member of the Communist Party briefly and then being a member of the Senate and so forth. So there are a lot of different versions of Césaire, and that's only recently that James Arnold has republished the early versions of Césaire, which are almost as unknown as the unknown of Fanon. So looking for the influence of Césaire, don't look for the late versions, look for the early versions, and those are the ones that Fanon himself knew. And he took from Césaire the particular idiom of his surrealism, but in a way you could say that Fanon's language is a bit like Césaire's language on steroids. It's actually much more intense than Césaire's. But also the Nietzscheanism of Césaire. Again, people who know the later Césaire, that comes as a surprise, but Césaire in his early work, in his journal, Tropique, there's large, significant interest in the work of Nietzsche. Because Césaire had discovered in Nietzsche's critique of European values, you can think of the logic of this, and of European culture, his stress on the necessity of a self-creation of new values, which of course is very much the mode of black skin, white masks, as a form of self-affirmation. This was a fulcrum that could be used for colonized people who've been relegated by colonialism to the negativity of the position of the so-called inferior and uncivilized and so forth. And Césaire's critique of the politics of French culture is enforced by the really violent language of surrealism, which of course is itself an attack on French rationalism and clarity and virtues of French civilization as traditionally defined. The attraction of Nietzsche for Fanon was, I think, can be understood through Jasper's argument, that it's Nietzsche who holds out the possibility that the ressentiment of disempowerment can be reconstructed by the dispossessed into a new form of creative empowerment. So disempowerment is recreated as a new form of creative empowerment. And that really is something that Fanon stuck with, I think, throughout his life. If you think about The Wretched of the Earth, it's all about, as it were, creating a new human, moving from your colonial disempowerment, fighting against it, and yourself being the agent, moving from spectator to agent, who creates a new mode of empowerment, a new version, new moment of value. And that's also the way that Fanon thought about his therapeutic practice in psychiatry. It's always about this transformation or transmutation, as a word that he used later on to describe describe that. And that can be both individual and then social as well. So briefly, I'll just say a few more words about Colonial Hands. It's set on a Greek island, and there's no general political situation set out for the rule of Polixos, the ruler. He's just put there. There's no historical parallel set up as there is in Césaire, who sets up very much the figure of Toussaint Louverture. There's no implicit allegory alluding to present circumstances as in Sartre, Lemouche. We're just presented with the island, Polixos the king, the lost son, wedding day, but no, he's not going to get married, he's going to kill him to effect this political transformation. It's a play which apparently stages a kind of revolutionary hero who sacrifices himself to rid this island of 2 millennia, 2,000 years of complacent rule by working through an Oedipal drama by killing his own father. The drama of the play is less the murder of the king himself, which, as in all good Greek tragedy, happens off stage, and is presented as inevitable. There's no real kind of, except for Polixos, who is woken up with a few bad omens and realizes what's going to happen to him. But apart from Polixos, nobody's really too bothered with that. It's actually the drama of the play is really concerned with the dynamics of Oedipus. Oedipus Rex, the play rethought and refashioned as a play about revolutionary consciousness from the perspective of Courgette's reading of Hegel's Master Slave, which Fanon knew. So it's about a struggle for power, and it's a fight to the death between the king and his son, the king and his subject, the master and the slave, the father and the son. Fanon conflates all these things together. If you remember Isaac Julian's film, Black Skin, White Masks, there are a couple of times when Stuart Hall is talking about Black Skin, White Masks, and very remarkably, he picks out of that text, without having read Parallel Hands, obviously, exactly the degree to which in Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon is also actually conflating these two entities of the father and the son, the master and the slave, and putting all these things together. It's really worth going back to what Hall says there, because his perceptiveness, I think, in terms of what is now much clearer to me anyway, that what Fanon is doing is really remarkable. There was a contemporary reference in terms of Martinique, which is that during the Second World War, the French admiral named Robert took over and allied the island to the Pétain's regime in France, but there was a revolution against him, and it then moved to the Free French. And I think you can see that there's a kind of colonial dimension there in the background. There's also, of course, the Césaire's Toussaint Louverture in the background. But what's interesting about Fanon's play is he doesn't emphasize that. He actually is much more interested in Epidemos as a sort of semi-repentant Oedipus son, as the play concludes. He's basically portrayed as a revolutionary who pays the cost of his superhuman self-assertion. And his fierce resolution and self-confidence that he espouses to Audley in the earlier scenes becomes much more equivocal when he sees the consequences of unleashing death and disorder by killing his father. And particularly when he's challenged by his mother and mother-in-law, who criticize him for what he's done. His concern really is to simply realize the power of his own superhumanity or superhumanness, to move words into action by killing his father, Polixos. So he will, just to quote a few lines, he says, "An act I want to splash or splatter this pregnant sky with a vertiginous act. Parallel hands make the starched world ring out with the new act. Odlane, on reaching volcanic extremes, speech makes itself act." There's this huge emphasis on making speech act, making words, thought into action. And behind the constant image here of volcanic eruption and explosion, we of course have, first of all, the historical example of the famous volcano Martinique Montpellier, which in 1902 erupted and killed 30,000 people, the entire population of the capital of Saint-Pierre. And behind that is the image of Saint-Domingue, or Haiti, the Haitian Revolution of 1791, where again the volcano is often used as the image of revolution, the image of, as we're just blowing this whole society up, literally sort of covering it with lava and starting again from a clean slate. And of course, if you think about pour moi, the image of explosion is there all the time too. The very opening line is the explosion won't happen today, it's too soon or it's too late. But then at a particular moment of racism to which he's subject, Fanon says, "I explode." He's constantly invoking the idea of explosion as this destructive moment. So while the narrative can be read as revolutionary, which it certainly is, the subject of the play could also be described as a staging of an explosive surrealist shock. And shock, of course, is one of the dominant concepts of surrealism. And his staging of the explosion of the self as a social revolutionary act. Joby reported that after Fanon completed Act 3, he didn't know how to end the play. He arrived in Dunkirk saying, "I don't know how to end the play." So, and then Joby arranged for him to have a stenographer, and he went off to the cemetery and finished it there. There are some missing scenes in the manuscript there, and there seem to be possibilities that he certainly thought of different potential endings. And in a way, it doesn't actually matter how the play does end, because the central moment of the scene, of the play, is actually this staging of the shock to society. And by killing the king, he's administered a total shock, which as I said, connects up to Fanon's enthusiasm for electric and other shock treatments, which in French is is described by the term anéantisme, which is rather chillingly translated in English as the annihilation method. So Fanon's idea was to actually annihilate. You erase the past to reconstruct the new. So the killing of Polixos seems to be designed to give that sort of shock to the society of the boss, and it will really, the shock itself, it seems, he relies on the shock itself to effect the necessary change. He hasn't planned any reconstruction, and to that degree, I think it differs from Wretched of the Earth, because by Wretched of the Earth, Fanon had extended the idea that actually the liberation struggle itself can be a form of social therapy, it can be a reconstructive struggle. The culture is the struggle. The struggle would produce the new formation of Algerian society, and that was a collective struggle that he emphasized again and again. But in the non-parallel, because it's an individual revolutionary, it's not a collective group of revolutionaries, there's really no anticipation on his part as to what he's going to put into his place. He leaves that to his mother and his mother-in-law. what revolutionaries imagined as really is a kind of Nietzschean Dionysian self-sacrifice, and maybe we could actually say today almost a martyrdom. It's a martyrdom, self-martyrdom again, in order to effect this change, but he's not going to be there to supervise what follows after. Okay, I'll stop there and we'll now listen to and experience some of the place we talked about. Thank you.